From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Toronto's second lockdown has turned the city quiet again. And this time, some of the people who live in this city, they're leaving. Toronto's population has ballooned over the past 2 decades, but many people have been squeezed out by rising living costs, by crazy bidding wars. The pandemic has only sped up those departures. A Stats Canada report shows more than 50,000 residents left Toronto between July 2019 and July 2020, many moving to smaller towns around the GTA. Is Toronto dying? What is a city if not its people and the culture they bring? Today, on This Matters, we're talking to David Ryder, Toronto Star City Hall Bureau Chief, on a Toronto that is shrinking in some ways, but ready to bloom in others. Dave, it's good to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you.
Pre-pandemic, Toronto was by almost every metric booming, right? Population growth and jobs, and we could see the cranes in the sky building all these condos. What's happened since the pandemic? What did the stats tell us about Toronto's population now?
Right. For my job and for interest, I read a lot of cities literature. And I think a lot of people living in Toronto who are think, oh, City Hall doesn't work, or the city, I'm always, the TTC's broken down. They don't realize that on global metrics, Toronto is a huge success. Journals all over the world write about people coming to Toronto, our ethnic diaspora, our bustling tech sector. So all those things, to a certain degree, have ground to a halt during the pandemic because we're not having a lot of international immigration. Business is working as well as people can from home. The one thing that has continued is something that's kind of on the bottom or on the surface of that success is an outmigration of people, and it's accelerated during the pandemic. And that's people who live in Toronto who have decided to move primarily to a smaller community near Toronto. So these are the big ones. I mean, we talked about Hamilton for years, has been getting a lot of people from Toronto. Peterborough, Milton is a big one. Oshawa actually gained the most. That's really picked up speed. And there was a Statistics Canada report just recently that said that Toronto had a record outmigration, which is a little over 50,000 more people moved out of Toronto to other neighboring communities than moved in. It's a bit of a shock when you think so many people in Ontario, you think so many industries where you think, if I'm going to make it, either to go to school or to get my job. If you're growing up in advertising and you're a kid in Peterborough or some small town in Ontario, Toronto's the big city, right? But there's enough drivers for people to leave. There's a few obvious factors, but that trend has definitely picked up.
You talked to people who've taken the plunge and left the city. What were some of their reasons that they told you about why they got out of Dodge?
Yeah, I think the overriding reason that has been going on for, experts say maybe 4 or 5 years, is affordability. It is just such an expensive city to live in. And so basically, I talked to a woman, Mary Margaret Jones, who moved with her family to Peterborough. She's a civil servant and her partner has a good, she's sort of middle management type job. And she said they didn't own, they rented. They lived in Bloorydale Village in the west end of Toronto. They loved their neighborhood. She said they lived their life in Toronto in lots of ways, but they were never going to be able to buy. They just did the math and they said, there's just no way when a basic house here now is costing $1 million or more. It's just never going to happen. That dream of ownership is dead for them. So the really fascinating thing is that was kind of a pre-existing condition. The new part is that COVID, she said, shrunk their world to their neighborhood. They weren't going out to plays and they weren't going to the King West restaurant trip. They were stuck in their neighborhood. And she said they realized they actually loved it. What they loved was what she said, the small city or the kind of villagey vibe of it. And they realized, you know what, if this is what we really love, we don't have to have this big, expensive metropolis around it. That's new that they experienced that. What else besides a pandemic would keep them so close to home? And then the other big factor is the ability to work remotely for an employer in Toronto. So both of them have been working from home for a while. It's working for them. And they said, let's look at real estate that's far enough away that if we have to come into the city, it's possible. They're not moving to Sault Ste. Marie. They're moving to Peterborough. But that we can get what the kind of the ownership plus the kind of lifestyle and that villagey feel that we can't get here. So what they've got in Peterborough, it's pretty remarkable. They moved from a 3-bedroom apartment in Toronto, where they were paying basically about $3,000 a month, all including utilities. They've got a nice house in an established neighborhood of Peterborough with a 165-foot lot with lots of trees, and their total mortgage is $1,000 less than they were paying in Toronto, and they're getting equity because it's a mortgage because they're paying into it. So what Mary Margaret said is every morning now she's taking a walk. There's like a ravine, but it's not like a Toronto ravine where there's going to be all sorts of other families. Like she says, there almost doesn't bump into anybody. Her daughter is able to toboggan in their backyard. They're working fine. And then they're walking out and they're just having a better quality of life. She said, really, she's only been there a week. And she said, she didn't want to jinx it, but her quality of life is dramatically improved.
Right. Like who in Toronto hasn't thought about that? Even if somebody can afford that kind of home, you look, okay, for what I'm paying for in rent, I could get a pretty nice place outside of the city. The amenities that a lot of people enjoy, whether it's the restaurants or the concerts, that's gone for the time being. Work from home is a constant for a lot of people now. So it's a confluence of factors, but all of that is playing a part into why people are leaving.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's really picked up. I mean, so you have the perfect storm of the housing prices haven't really gone down. Rents have gone down a bit, but then that would mean, okay, if you're in her apartment and you're established, you have to go and move into another apartment. And then who says the economy picks back up and they're going to try and jack up your rent? But yeah, I think for a while, people have been cashing out, selling out their Toronto home and getting something bigger. But I think the confluence of remote work plus the fact that you can get renters. She's not walking out of here with a big bag of money, but there's enough of a drive and it's easy enough now to move to somewhere like Peterborough that you have somebody like her family saying, okay, that's it, we're going to make the move.
You touched on this a little bit in your reporting, but is the ability to choose where you live, and by that I mean the ability to work from home, have an employer that would allow that to happen, have the financial ability to actually move, is that itself a privilege too?
It is, totally. And I did have some comments, and I did address in the story that if you can work remotely, chances are you're not a grocery worker, you're not a factory worker, you're not the kind of frontline people who have been disproportionately hit by COVID and who primarily live in the northwest and northeast corners of Toronto, where the COVID rates have been the highest in the city. There is a privilege to it. As I pointed to some, again, this isn't somebody who is walking away with $1 million in their pocket. This is somebody who is renting and not putting any money aside and has decided to try and trade off some great things about Toronto and try and find other great things in a cheaper place to live. So yeah, there is some of that. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who are on the lower income scale who are able to work remotely. I don't know if you were like a basic bookkeeper or part-time, something like that, but there is definitely a privileged part of it. But again, we all have read those stories about people who hit at the right mark and got out, maybe got $1.8 million for a house that they paid, $600,000 for, and then move out and then buy like a country spread in Caledon or something. This is more regular people, but regular people trying to find something that they can't find in a city that is spectacularly successful on almost all the global indicators, but has a widening income gap and has a huge affordability problem that is affecting not just low-income workers, but middle and even middle-high-income workers.
We'll be right back. You mentioned Oshawa, which saw the largest population increase in Canada over the last year. You spoke to Oshawa's mayor. What does he make of this surge in population?
I'd say he's excited by it. He said that the trend has been happening long enough that he and his colleagues at the city there see it coming and they've been planning and preparing for it. He said that there are already a couple of big housing developments coming on stream. And you'll remember last November, they had the great news that General Motors is not completely pulling out, that they're going to reinvest and have a lot of jobs there. But he acknowledges that the pandemic has quickened that migration of people from Toronto, a lot of them, to places like Oshawa. So he said that they're planning and preparing. I asked them, I said, are there going to be people in your city who are going to say, I liked old Oshawa. Like, I don't want these new people and I don't want traffic and I don't want tall buildings. Even a big city like Toronto, if you put up a 10-story tower in a neighborhood with a lot of single-family homes, there's a lot of opposition. So I can imagine a place like Oshawa, if all of a sudden you start talking about a lot of density, there's going to be uproar.
That's why they moved to Oshawa in the first place and not in downtown Toronto.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, Toronto's coming to me and I finally got away from it kind of thing. But he said that is going to be there. And he said that's the job of him, his planning department, to do the good planning decisions and put in the necessary infrastructure so that people can still have a good quality of life, even though there's more people and more cars and more commuters and all the rest of it, which is part of, again, Toronto's successful. But there was a period, I would say, from the time Toronto amalgamated in 98 until, the last few years, where all those 0% tax hikes and no new transit. And it was kind of like a lack of infrastructure, a lack of investment. And then we're paying the price for it now because the city is sort of bursting at the seams.
A city is a complex beast, especially a city as big and as nuanced and with as many pieces as Toronto is. And during the pandemic, many people have asked, what might Toronto look like after the pandemic? And you spoke to urbanists and city experts about this. What do they say about how this moment that we're living through, how might it affect what Toronto builds towards or what it will become?
I'd say a few things. One main one is that the ones I spoke to all felt Toronto is still going to be successful. That what Mayor John Tory often calls the city's good bones, which is a welcoming place, a place known for being, very open-minded, for being diverse and having a good transit system, having walkable neighborhoods, all that kind of stuff is still going to be there. So it's not like we're going to wither on the vine. And although out-migration from Toronto to smaller communities is going up, immigration still made Toronto's population overall go up, even though there wasn't that much immigration last year. That's going to come bouncing back. We're still going to be a growing city. So there's that. The big change, I think, is going to be, you're losing a lot of families. Those are primarily the ones who are moving. So that could alter the demographic kind of balance of the city. I think the big one is downtown. What happens if there are estimates that maybe 30% of people who are currently working from home continue working from home after the pandemic, either all or a lot of the time. You look at all those big skyscrapers with all those office towers in the central business district, the real core of the city, who's going to need that space and what's going to go in there? So a guy like Richard Florida at U of T, who's, a really well-known urbanist, he says, there is a chance Toronto has a housing crisis. There is a chance to maybe fill a lot of those towers with housing and to turn it into a walkable neighborhood, maybe a mix of live workspace, and not have it a place that kind of, to some degree, a lot of cities, it really empty out at night. I'd say Toronto has less of that problem than a lot of places, but you could make it much more of just more of a living neighborhood as opposed to a working neighborhood or strictly a working neighborhood. So those are the kind of the big changes on the horizon. There are in the city's literature right now, there's a lot of talk about urban sprawl and the fact that the ability to work from home maybe is going to kind of be the death of cities. And maybe that the urbanization trend of the last 30 or 40 years is going to reverse and it's going to be a suburbanization trend. I think there is a danger, some American cities especially, where they've had problems where the core is emptied out over years anyway. There's a lot of crime downtown. People just don't want to kind of be there. I think there's a danger of those places losing what little excitement and activity and vibrancy they have downtown. The people I talked to said they don't think Toronto has enough strengths built in and resiliency that's probably not going to happen. But it's going to be a different city. And it's kind of fascinating to me because I remember when the terrorist attacks happened in New York, there was a lot of speculation about how this was going to change everything. And most of them, I think, turned out to be wrong. Like, we really don't know what the long-term impacts of this are going to be. I remember reading pieces at the time saying nobody's going to want to work in an office tower in the downtown again because they're going to be sitting ducks for an attack. That obviously hasn't been the case. So we don't really know, but the best estimates are that Toronto is going to survive and thrive, but it will be a different city. The one thing I'll add is that they all said that there is an opportunity, those kind of the growing gap, the inequity in Toronto that we've seen. The Stars covered, we did a series called Divided City and lots of other coverage over the years on the growing gap between rich and poor in this city. There's an opportunity to kind of build back better, to try and do targeted government investment and partnerships with the private sector to try and bridge that gap. But the experts say that if you just continue on as you are, it's actually going to get worse. This could accelerate that problem. And what we've seen in the United States is the people who are making the most out of the pandemic are the richest people. The top 1% of America and Canada, I'm sure, are gaining all kinds of income, and the bottom 1% or the bottom 10% are paying the price of the pandemic.
That's such a huge point, because I think the pandemic in so many walks of life has made people confront the inequalities that exist, of the huge gap of the haves and the have-nots in our society. And even the way you were talking about, well, what does the future look like? I know to a certain extent it's looking through a crystal ball, but when we think about how Toronto might confront some of these problems, for instance, we saw more use of public space than ever in the summer. Things were happening in this city that 5 years ago we wouldn't necessarily think was possible. But because of a pandemic, it's restructured the way we want to use our city. That's
a great point. And Shoshana Sachs from U of T is a very smart urban thinker I talked to. She said that a lot of people felt sort of frustrated in the city and kind of not enough places to get out and do things. And all of a sudden, when the pandemic said, hey, then the city of Toronto said, hey, we're going to close parts of major roads so that people can get out and bike and walk and rollerblade or whatever they want to do on Lakeshore Boulevard or something on a Saturday or Sunday. A lot of people loved it when they said, hey, we're going to take a curb lane of traffic where normally it might be parked cars or maybe just people sitting there waiting for their friend to come out of the coffee shop. And we're going to turn that into restaurant patios. People loved it. In the winter, the city has increased the amount of winter maintenance that allows people to use parks more easily through the winter, and things like having washrooms that are normally closed, having them open, clearing off trails, tennis courts. I mean, there's snow outside right now, but yesterday I walked by a tennis court in my neighborhood and there was people out playing like it was July. They had a couple of extra layers on, but the nets were up, and normally the nets wouldn't be up, and normally nobody would be sort of clearing off that court. So it's a chance for, I think, the people to say, hey, this is what we want, and this will make the city more livable, and maybe keep more of those people there, because Mary Margaret said living with people on top of you and not having space was one of the reasons she left, that maybe we can address that. And it's a bit of a rethink. And Toronto has, been a bit of a car culture city. I'd say less so certainly in the last 10 years, with things like taking up a lane of traffic, either for patios or for people to walk and bike. That does require a bit of a reset of your brain. And we've tried some of those things. The world hasn't ended. Toronto can do some of these things. Yeah. And I'd say Mayor Tory seems quite bullish on continuing it. He has said a few times that Active TO, which is the program with the closing streets for people to get out, and it is going to continue this summer. I think when it comes to city council, it would be interesting because city council is still very much divided along urban-suburban lines, the downtown versus the suburban councillors. And Mayor Tory might want it, but he has to get a majority of councillors. And I know that there's some, even if it's not in their neighborhood, they really feel like a moral objection to closing a lane of car traffic. Dave, thanks again for all your time and for your reporting on this. Anytime. Thanks. And that is David Ryder, the Toronto Star's City Hall Bureau Chief. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.